Hi, so welcome back to another video. This video is called Why Did I? And in this video we're going to think about trauma response. So we're going to think a little bit about why you responded the way that you responded to your experience, and hopefully put a little bit of context to that response, thinking about science, thinking about some of the social scripts that we hear around how people should respond to these experiences, and hopefully normalize how you've responded and really send the message that everybody responds differently to experiences like this, and they are very much unique to you and specifically what happened to you. But before we go any further, as always, it's really important that you are taking care of yourself while watching these videos. So making yourself as comfy as you possibly can be, whether that's grabbing yourself a hot drink, putting a little bit of background music on, whatever you do to make yourself feel comfortable. You may maybe just want to pause the video and do that if you're not already. And it's also really important to just remind you that, you know, we have good days and bad days potentially, and if you're finding yourself feeling a little bit overwhelmed by some of this content today, or you're just not feeling like it's the right day to explore this, you can always come back at a later date. So these videos are designed to be accessible whenever you need them. So don't ever feel like you have to keep watching. If it's not feeling right for you today, just pause and, you know, come back to it later, or choose something else instead. So yeah, trauma response, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the idea of a trauma response is that it explains how and why we respond to certain situations in the way that we do. And typically it's situations where we feel threatened in some way. It will trigger a response in us that is unconscious, and it basically is our brain and body's way of keeping us safe, of protecting us in some way throughout that experience. But throughout this video, we're also going to think a little bit about trauma responses not just being something that happens in the acute stages of an experience, but actually that a trauma response can linger. They can stay with us for quite some time actually, and that's something that's not often spoken about. So I really want to normalize that in this video, because a trauma response can actually shape how we adapt to future experiences. It can shape how we interact sometimes within our relationships, and it can generally just change aspects of how we think and feel. And this is completely normal, and it is something that we can manage, and we do talk about that in some of our sort of tactic videos. But the idea of today is to get a kind of basic understanding of what trauma responses are, how they work, some of the myths around trauma response. And if there was one key takeaway that I would hope you would get from this message, is that everybody will have a unique way of responding. And that will depend, like everything else, it will depend on so many things. So as humans, we're all unique. So we will all think and feel in different ways. And that's very much related to our upbringing, our past experiences, personality factors, but also the threat that we perceive and what our brain and body feels we need to do in that moment to keep us safe. So in that sense, everybody's response will be slightly different because everybody's experience is different. So as I said in some of the intro videos, what happened to you and nobody else. So how you responded will be unique to the context of your experience. And we talk about that in a little bit more depth in some of our other videos. So we think about the specific situation that you may have been in. We think about maybe who has done this to you, and we explore it in a lot more depth so that it feels really relevant to your experience. But it can also be really helpful to get a basic understanding of trauma response in general, because it can help us to understand how we may have felt at the time, why we may have done what we've done, and also how we might have felt afterwards, and perhaps even how you feel now. And I think with awareness, we naturally become more empowered to be able to better understand ourselves and better manage any feelings that we have. So for that reason, I think this video was really important to get a general understanding before talking about perhaps some of your specific experiences. So we're going to talk about a basic model of trauma response that is called the 5 F's of trauma. And although it's a really great model and it's really accessible and it really nicely explains some of the different responses, it's really important to recognise that this is not an exhaustive list. So I don't want you to be watching this video and kind of getting to the end of it and thinking, but none of those responses really reflected what I did or how I felt. That's totally normal. It's a very general overview, and although most people will probably see aspects of themselves within one or even multiple of these responses, it doesn't mean that anything different is abnormal. It just means that perhaps the situation that you were in needed a slightly different response. And I think a good example of what I mean by that is these responses, they are our way of adapting to danger and what we perceive to be the threat at the time. But if we take something like grooming, for example, the very nature of grooming means that people often aren't able to recognise or don't always recognise straight away that they're actually in any danger, because they've been conditioned in a way to think that the person harming them loves them, or they love that person themselves. So actually it can take many years perhaps for those individuals to recognise that they were actually in danger, because they've not processed those experiences. So only perhaps at the time of processing might we start to see a trauma response coming from that person. And so actually it's important to highlight those things, because at the time of any abuse actually happening, if that sort of sounds similar to your situation, then you may not have presented with any of those responses. And again, that in itself is a way of protecting yourself. So interpret these responses with caution. And if you have any thoughts or specific questions relating to your specific experience, then please get in touch, and hopefully we can have a conversation about that. It's also really, really worth noting that there's a lot of messages in society around how people should respond to experiences like yours, and perhaps a lot of ideas and perceptions around how you think you may respond to danger. And that can often lead to questions coming from ourselves or questions coming from other people around us as to why we didn't respond in a certain way. I'm sure some of you may have heard messages like, why didn't you report it? Why didn't you run away? Why didn't you fight them? And actually, what can happen is sometimes we can start to internalize those messages and develop a really critical and quite blaming way of looking at how we responded. And that can be really detrimental to our overall well-being, but also the healing process as well. So it's important that we start to question some of those scripts and actually recognize that they're really not very accurate. And hopefully we can do that through the 5 F's of trauma response. So you may have heard of the fight and flight mechanisms, and you may even heard of the freeze response. But actually there are 2 other responses called friend and flop as well, that are less known to people. They're not as highly spoken about. So sometimes this could be the way that you're responding, but actually nobody's named it. So it's felt like it might have been the wrong way to respond, and it may have contributed to some of those critical messages that you've been receiving or maybe even giving to yourself. So if we take the fight response first, it's essentially an activating response. So what happens when our brain starts to perceive that we are in threat, we're in danger in some way, it will send signals to our body that we need to respond in a way that protects ourselves through fighting the danger off. So, in your case, it may have looked like physically fighting them off, or it could be verbally taking action. So it could be shouting for help, it could be screaming, essentially anything that aims to fight the person off or the situation. And this is perhaps one of the most, I suppose, misunderstood responses. I think it's a response that most people may even assume that they would do themselves if they were in danger. And like I mentioned earlier, it's definitely the response that we can be met with from society sometimes, asking questions of why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you do more to stop them? But actually what we know is that the fight response is the least common response to situations like your experience, because it's not always the most optimal way of protecting ourselves. And your brain will pick up on those cues. It won't ask you what you want to do. It happens outside of your awareness, and it will decide what it thinks is the most protective thing to do for yourself. So despite those messages, it's really, really not a common response. And I think that's why sometimes we can start to blame ourselves, and we can start to question whether we should have done more. And that's not to say that some of you may be watching this video and thinking, well, I did fight, and actually that does reflect my response. And that's not to say that that's not completely normal. It's an adaptive response if it feels right in that situation. And it's also a really brave response. So if you're watching this video and it does reflect your response, please don't think that there's anything wrong with how you've responded. It's just important to highlight that it's not the most common response. So it's not something that the majority of people will do. And that's why it's so important to highlight how unique these responses are. There isn't a kind of one size fits all response here. So the flight response, it's also an activating state. So our brain and body will again put resources into activating our muscles. It will want us to do something. But instead of putting those resources towards the danger, it actually encourages us to put them away from the danger. So we may want to run away and try and escape the situation. But it can also be a cognitive. So we think of cognitive as being our minds, our thinking. It can be thoughts like, something's not quite right, I need to get out of here, or, I need to leave this situation. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will, but those thoughts themselves represent the type of flight response that can happen. But unfortunately, we know that people aren't always able to escape the situation. They're not always able to safely leave. And that's why it's so important that this is highlighted, because again, there's perhaps a oversimplified view by people in society who maybe don't understand these things in a lot of depth, who suggest, well, you could have just left the room, you could have ran away. But we know it's not as simple as that. And those things can probably leave people feeling like they should have done more, that they didn't do enough. But again, we don't ask ourselves how we want to respond. This is very much an automatic thing that is attempting to keep us safe. And it reflects absolutely nothing about who you are as a person or how you felt during the experience or after the experience as well. And running away isn't always possible for lots of different reasons. But one of those reasons is actually the freeze response. So this is one of the responses that essentially, like it says on the tin, we freeze up. So, you may have experienced trying to shout or trying to speak up for yourself in some way, but physically not being able to get the words out. You may have tried to move, but felt like you didn't necessarily have control over your body, or you just froze up like a statue almost. And although this is unconscious, it's our body's way of trying to prevent us from further harm. So it is a really adaptive way of responding to these types of experiences, and it is the most common as well. But like the others, it can leave us questioning, why did I not move? Why didn't I say something? And those messages can really plant a seed in our heads, and they can be really overwhelming. But I hope that through this video and through some of our other videos around managing these thoughts and some of these blaming messages, we can start to develop a less critical and more compassionate way of looking at how we responded to these situations. And with the freeze response, it's also really important to highlight that all of these responses can linger, as I mentioned earlier. So the freeze response might play a role in how able we feel to talk about it, or to report to the police, to report to anybody, just to even speak about it. And we may feel like we physically can't make any decisions about what we need or even how we feel. And this is an example of an ongoing freeze response. And again, it doesn't say anything about you as a person or what happened. Now, the fourth response is friend. And this is one that is perhaps less commonly known, and it definitely carries some misunderstanding and maybe a little bit of stigma as well. And although I'm going to use this as an example, it definitely doesn't mean that this is the only time you would use the friend response. But it is more common in situations where there may be ongoing harm. It may be that you are very familiar with the person who's harming you. So it could be within a relationship, it could be a family member, or even a friend as well. And essentially this response, it's a way of trying to appease the person who's harming you. Whether that's to try and calm them down, whether that's to sort of bargain with them in a way to protect yourself, but also to protect somebody else as well. It might be that you're in a family situation where you're trying to protect other people in the home. It may be within a relationship context where there are children involved. And so you're using that befriending approach to try and protect other people. Or it might look like trying to reduce the harm in some way. So it might look like almost an acceptance that something is going to happen, but reducing what that looks like or how much the person hurts you. And it's a really adaptive response in those situations, but it is misunderstood, and it can lead to more blaming messages and questions like, but why didn't you tell anybody? Why didn't anybody else see it? Or why did you stay for so long? But as you know, it's not as simple as that. And so if you're watching this and this response is resonating with you somehow, some of our Tame the Blame videos might be helpful. And like I mentioned earlier with the specific context videos, it might be helpful to explore in a little bit more depth something that reflects your experience in more detail, so that we can explore some of these feelings and topics in more depth. And again, if you have any questions about any of that or any thoughts, then please get in touch and we will try and create some content that's helpful. So the final 5 F's is the flop response. And essentially, the flop response happens when we have an influx of cortisol, which is basically a stress hormone. So if our body is in overwhelming danger, or it perceives ourselves to be in overwhelming danger, then it almost shuts down parts of the body that we don't need. And the best way to kind of highlight this is to think about an animal. So to think about, I suppose, if you're watching a nature documentary and there's a predator chasing after an animal, you might witness it kind of playing dead. So it will maybe sort of collapse to the floor, stay really still. It's motionless. As human beings, we recreate that essentially in the flop response. So you might find that your muscles kind of go limp. You don't necessarily feel present. You might feel quite zoned out. You may not even remember responding in that way. And that is essentially our way of shutting down and shutting off from the experience and kind of disconnecting in some way. Almost like a rag doll. But it is also important to highlight that disconnection to the experience can be seen in some of the other responses as well. So it's not just that response that kind of invokes this zoned out state. That's almost like an additional layer of protection, really. And that's something that's also important to highlight, is that you may actually have watched this thinking, well, more than one of those responses reflects how I felt at the time or what I did. And that makes perfect sense, because these responses almost act like a hierarchy. So we'll start with the one up here that we think is most protective. And if that's not working, we'll move our way down the ladder, so to speak, and we'll find something that does feel the most protective. And I do feel like I've hammered this message home, but it's so important that how you responded was so unique to you and the very specific context of what was happening to you at the time. And it was a completely unconscious response to a really abnormal experience. And however you responded was what your brain deemed as being the most protective thing for you in that moment. And as I've mentioned, it's also good to improve awareness that these trauma responses don't just stop after the experience does. So they can stay with us and they can influence so many things about how we feel and how we experience things. And we can re-experience these trauma responses as well. So if we think about being triggered, so something that reminds us of the event, we might find ourselves adopting a similar trauma response. It might be a different response. But actually we talk about that a little bit more in our triggered video. And we think about ways that we can manage those triggers to hopefully reduce the unpleasant feelings that they might give you. Because if we think about trauma responses as being protective patterns, so there are patterns that we use to protect ourselves. But actually through knowledge and through learning and kind of empowering ourselves to become more aware, we can create new patterns. And hopefully through these videos and the work that you're doing on yourselves, we can develop new patterns that still make us feel safe, but they maybe don't have some of the adverse consequences. And we can do that in a way that's much more compassionate and hopefully with a much less critical way of looking at our responses. So I hope that's been helpful. As always, I would really love to hear from you, whether that's just a little comment at the bottom of this video, maybe something that you've learned, something that you've enjoyed, or maybe something that you didn't enjoy, or something that wasn't quite clear and you'd like to know more about. Whatever it is, it would be so lovely to hear from you. And if it has sparked some curiosity or any questions about anything that I've mentioned, or maybe there's things that I haven't mentioned that you'd like to know more about, please get in touch and we will hopefully try and create some content that's really unique to your needs and what you need, and hopefully be helpful to other people as well.